It was the 16th of November 1996, and Harold James Nicholson was walking across the tarmac at Dulles International Airport, his camera bag slung over his shoulder. He was the branch chief in the Counterterrorism Center based at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Inside his bag were 10 rolls of undeveloped film containing some of America's most closely guarded secrets. He was boarding a flight to Switzerland, where Russian intelligence officers were waiting to pay him for betraying his own country. What Nicholson didn't know was that FBI agents were closing in from all sides. As he approached the aircraft stairs, the trap was sprung. Agents surrounded him, and in that moment, they had within their grasp the highest-ranking CIA officer ever caught spying for a foreign power. But this arrest wasn't the end of Jim Nicholson's story of betrayal. In fact, it was only the beginning. Harold James Jim Nicholson was truly a child of the Cold War. He was born on the 17th of November 1950, the day after US President Harry Truman declared a national emergency due to the Korean War and the perceived threat of communist expansion. His early life in Woodburn, Oregon, was one steeped in military and intelligence culture. His biological father left the family when he was young, and his mother, a former Army cryptographer, remarried Marvin Nick Nicholson, a career Air Force officer who formally adopted Jim at age 7. 1957 was the year that the Soviet Union launched its Sputnik satellite. That metallic sphere circling Earth every 90 minutes was a scientific triumph that demonstrated Moscow's potential ability to deliver nuclear destruction to American soil. For the next 12 years, Air Force bases became Jim's playgrounds, and America's existential fear became his daily backdrop. The Nicholson family never stayed anywhere too long. His upbringing was transient. The family moved constantly with each change in his stepfather's duty station. This was a lifestyle that made it difficult for the innately shy boy to form lasting friendships. He was always the new kid, constantly having to adapt to new schools, new faces, and new places. Jim found solace in books. At the Edwards Air Force Base in California's Mojave Desert, teenage Jim immersed himself in spy fiction. From James Bond to Napoleon Solo and even the bumbling Maxwell Smart, he idolized the men who were portrayed as being able to change the course of history and look cool doing it. Jim Nicholson spent his formative high school years at Desert High School on Edwards Air Force Base before graduating from Novato High School in California in 1969. This was the peak of the Vietnam War and anti-war protests. Then the Watergate scandal shook American faith in their political leadership. Jim refused to participate in a massive sit-in protesting the Vietnam War at his high school. With military blood already running through his veins, Jim chose loyalty to authority over popular rebellion. At Oregon State University, Jim enrolled in the Reserve Officers Training Corps. He seemed destined to follow the family tradition of military service. It was there, in early 1973, that he met a petite young lady named Laura Sue Cooper, who went by Laurie. A cheeky joke made as she was weighing herself before fencing training and a flirtatious return slug to the arm later, the couple were in love. Jim proposed less than a week after their first date, and Laurie said yes without hesitation. Their wedding on the 10th of June 1973 would have made for a good military recruitment poster. Laurie wore white, while Jim stood proud in his army dress uniform, having graduated third in his class. With Vietnam winding down and no war left to fight, Jim set his sights on military intelligence. For Jim, the enemy might have been hidden, but the mission remained the same: defeat communism wherever it threatened American interests. Fort Devens introduced Jim to the art of code breaking, and his superiors quickly recognized his talent. By 1975, he was bound for Okinawa in Japan, where the Army Security Agency monitored communist activities across Asia. This was a dream assignment for Jim, real intelligence work against America's enemies. For Laurie, It was the beginning of a slow descent into resentment and isolation. She had abandoned her own college education to follow her husband's career and soon developed disdain for the officer's wife role that she was expected to play. In Okinawa, Jim's star rose steadily. Promotions came regularly, commendations accumulated, and he earned a master's degree in counseling while working nights as a volunteer counselor for military families. But success bred arrogance and ambition bred neglect. Laurie watched her husband disappear into his work, surfacing only to attend mandatory social functions where she felt invisible and unnecessary. The breaking point approached when Jim earned his master's degree before Laurie could finish her abandoned bachelor's. When she expressed interest in returning to school, an argument ensued, which devolved into a fight about infidelity, with both sides accusing the other of cheating. Their marriage was starting to crack, but the army had other plans for Jim Nicholson. Nicholson was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the army, and for a while, everything seemed to be going according to plan. He performed well, rising to the rank of captain and serving as a company commander in the U.S. Army's prestigious 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. His specialized training in cryptography earned him a staff position in Army intelligence, placing him firmly within the national security apparatus. The trouble was that his professional success continued to be at odds with his domestic life. Laurie remained deeply unhappy with the constant relocations inherent in military life. After the birth of their first child, Jeremiah, in 1978, Jim finally relented and agreed to resign from the army. He bought an expensive three-piece pinstripe suit and sent his resume to corporations across America. The Nicholson family moved to Kansas City, where Jim took a civilian job with Hallmark cards. He became a Mormon and grew out his beard. The transition to civilian life was a failure. After a year of making decorative candles for Middle America, he was profoundly bored. The mundane reality of his new life didn't suit someone who had dreamed of growing up to be James Bond come G.I. Joe. Jim Nicholson was desperate to work for the CIA, but the timing of his first application was inopportune. As the 1970s drew to a close, the agency, under the leadership of Stansfield Turner, had cut more than 800 jobs in what was called the Halloween Massacre in the wake of reduced Cold War tensions. But the world was changing. Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan, and Moscow was backing communist insurgents in Nicaragua. America needed spies again, and in early 1980, the CIA began rebuilding its human intelligence network. Jim flew east for his interview, and when he returned to Kansas City, he could barely contain his excitement. He had achieved his lifelong dream. The CIA had accepted him. On the 20th of October 1980, Jim Nicholson joined the CIA, becoming an operations officer. 2 weeks later, Ronald Reagan won the presidency, ensuring sufficient funding to enable the CIA to wage the Cold War globally. In 1981, Jim Nicholson entered its elite clandestine training program at Camp Peary, Virginia, the secretive facility known within the agency as the Farm. There he received paramilitary training, including parachuting, weapons handling, and rigging explosives. Finally, Jim Nicholson was exactly where he had always dreamed of being. While he was out training, Laurie was busy giving birth to their second child, a daughter whom they named Star. Laurie was already experiencing the loneliness of the long-distance CIA relationship and often felt like a single mother due to Jim's training schedule and secrecy about his work. The strains that developed during Jim's time in the army were starting to make a comeback. The 1980s were the twilight years of the Cold War, and for a CIA operations officer like Jim Nicholson, it was the perfect time to build a career. Jim embarked on a series of overseas assignments, specializing in operations targeting the intelligence services of the USSR and, after its fall in 1991, the Russian Federation. His assignments took him across the globe: Manila from 82 to 85, Bangkok from 85 to 87, Tokyo from 87 to 1989. He had direct, authorized contacts with targeted Soviet officials, honing the skills of a case officer on the front lines of the Cold War. His workdays often extended long into the night at bars and nightclubs, where he looked to cultivate new contacts. Jim found the work during his first assignment in Manila intoxicating. Real spy operations with real consequences. He was nicknamed Batman for his propensity to wade into the crowds of protesters lining the streets of Manila. He was delighted to be considered the station's very own caped crusader, but his lifestyle and commitment to the job was also corrosive to his family life. Manila's expatriate community offered plenty of opportunities for an ambitious CIA officer to network, socialize, and disappear for hours at a time. Rumors about Jim's infidelity started to circulate within the CIA station. Laurie confronted Jim after their housekeeper admitted to an affair, even saying that she was pregnant as a result. Jim denied it all. In July of 1984, their third child, Nathan, was born. Nobody could have anticipated the role that Nathan would later play in his father's double life. Shortly afterward, the family transferred to Bangkok, where Jim effectively vanished. His assignment required him to live in a CIA house more than 130 miles from his family. There he was tasked with monitoring refugee camps along the Thai-Cambodian border. He was supposed to return to Bangkok 4 days out of every 2 weeks, but his absences stretched longer and longer, sometimes lasting months. During this time, Jim fell in love with his beautiful young Thai interpreter. Nicholson's career peak came in 1990 when he was appointed as the CIA Chief of Station in Bucharest, Romania. A station chief is essentially the top spy in any given country. They oversee all intelligence operations, manage relationships with local governments, and report directly back to CIA HQ in Langley. This new senior role positioned Nicholson at the gateway for promotion one day to senior executive service. But even at the height of his professional success, warning signs were emerging. His workaholic lifestyle and escalating personal problems started to cause concern. Laurie herself was also guilty of infidelity, striking up a romantic relationship with a local man in Bucharest who she helped to teach English. By 1992, Jim Nicholson's personal life was in freefall. His family had moved 21 times in 23 years, and this placed an immense strain on his wife and 3 children. Add to that the infidelity on both sides, and the marriage soon imploded. Laurie returned to the US and filed for divorce, initiating a bitter and expensive custody battle. Jim was granted custody of the children on the basis that he held stable employment. The timing of all this couldn't have been worse for Jim. It coincided with his next major assignment in 1992, that of Deputy Chief of Station in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He was then facing the financial pressures of alimony, being a single dad to 3 kids abroad, and expensive legal fees. Not only this, but Nicholson was described by his ex-wife as having champagne tastes on a Budweiser budget. And this much was true. Jim Nicholson wanted the lifestyle of a wealthy man, something that his government salary did not permit. Yet he found the allure of gadgets and luxuries irresistible. From TVs, computers, and video game systems to tailor-made suits and, famously, his silver Rolex watch, he lived well beyond his means. It was the financial pressure and desire for material wealth that ultimately drove Jim Nicholson to espionage. There was a lot going on in the world of American intelligence in 1994. That year, the CIA had been rocked by the worst betrayal in its history, perhaps even to this day. Aldrich Ames, a 31-year CIA veteran, was arrested in February of that year and pleaded guilty 2 months later to spying for the Soviet Union and Russia. In all, he spied for 9 years and received $2.5 million for his efforts. His betrayal was catastrophic for the agency in particular, resulting in the compromise of nearly every significant CIA human asset targeting the Soviets. At least 10 of those he compromised were executed. The Ames affair exposed what a Senate report called gross negligence within the CIA, revealing a culture so insular and trusting that it was unable to fathom the possibility of a mole within its own ranks, even one as clumsy and conspicuous as Ames. The agency was in chaos. But where others saw a cautionary tale, Jim Nicholson saw something else entirely. In June of 1994, just weeks after Ames was sentenced to life in prison, Nicholson started to scheme. With ultimate cynicism, he calculated that with Ames gone, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR, might be in the market for another highly paid mole inside the CIA. Nicholson knew that Ames's betrayal had gotten people killed. He knew it had devastated American intelligence operations. This knowledge was, however, not enough to overcome his greed and growing sense of disillusionment. Jim convinced himself that Russia was no longer the bogeyman of the Soviet era. It was just a struggling democracy trying to find its place in the post-Cold War world. Surely, he thought, nobody would be harmed by him making a few extra bucks on the side selling secrets. Would they? Jim Nicholson crossed the Rubicon in June of 1994. His first act of betrayal was a brazen walk-in. While serving as deputy chief of station in Kuala Lumpur, Nicholson attended a meeting with Yuri Vlasov, an officer of the Russian SVR. The meeting itself was authorized by the CIA, part of his official duties to assess and potentially recruit foreign intelligence officers. For Jim Nicholson, this meeting was outwardly business as usual. Instead of recruiting for the USA, he offered his own services to Russia, making no bones about the fact that he wanted money in exchange. Meeting in a secure room in the Russian embassy, he told Vlasov that his tour in Malaysia was soon to end, and, citing the mounting expenses from his divorce and custody battle, he asked for $25,000. The Russian SVR officer was suspicious, wary that the offer may have been a dangle designed to entrap him. He asked with skepticism what information Nicholson thought he could provide, which was a question the spy-to-be had prepared for. Nicholson immediately turned over the identities of at least a dozen CIA assets in Kuala Lumpur. But this was just small fry. Nicholson explained that for his next assignment, he was to return to the US, where he would be an instructor at the farm, the CIA's covert training center through which he had himself graduated. There he would have access to the real identities of hundreds of CIA trainees. Many of these men and women would be destined for later assignment overseas, including to spy on Russia. There was not much more that needed to be said after this. For Vlasov, turning the American deputy station chief would be a major intelligence coup for the Russians and provide a major career boost for himself. A week later, Nicholson met Vlasov again at the Russian embassy. He was handed $25,000 in crisp $100 bills, with the assurance that Moscow was holding a further $75,000 for him to be paid in future. Plans were then agreed for Nicholson to meet his new handler secretly in New Delhi, and he was given a mail drop address in Harare in Zimbabwe for future communications. His photograph was taken for identification purposes, with his handler being able to recognize him by the Rolex on his right wrist. On the 30th of June 1994, just one day after his last reported meeting with the SVR officer, a wire transfer of $12,000 appeared in his Selco Credit Union savings account in Oregon. Just like that, the line had been crossed. Jim Nicholson was working as a double agent for the Russians. In late 1994, Jim Nicholson's overseas assignment came to an end, and he returned to the United States, moving to Camp Peary along with his 3 children. In his new role as an instructor at the CIA's clandestine training center, the Farm, he was responsible, in part, for the CIA's most precious assets, its future. As a freshly minted double agent and traitor, he saw this instead as his own personal gold mine. He had legitimate access to the complete personnel files, detailed biographical data, and future assignments of every new CIA case officer in the training classes of 1994, 95, and 96. Every year, the CIA recruits and trains a new class of case officers. These are America's future spies, people who will spend their careers in dangerous places, stealing secrets and protecting national security. Their identities are among the most closely guarded secrets in government, and Jim Nicholson had access to all of it. Nicholson's specific role was to teach spying tradecraft, the irony being that he was teaching his recruits how to avoid the very traps that he was helping to set for them. Nicholson's tradecraft was sophisticated and calculating, using the agency's own tools against them. He borrowed a high-resolution camera hidden inside a briefcase from the CIA's Office of Technical Services to photograph classified documents in his office. He also used a personal notebook computer to type and store summaries of classified information. What he stole included reports on US foreign policy, classified cables, and, crucially, the debriefings of Aldrich Ames, intelligence that would be invaluable to the SVR for assessing how their previous mole had been caught. Jim Nicholson used the US post office system to communicate with his handlers, sending postcards to foreign post office boxes. These postcards were signed with the alias Neville R. Streechy and contained coded messages about his assignments and planned travel. The choice of alias is interesting. Lytton Streechy was a famous British biographer and member of the Bloomsbury Group, known for his wit and unconventional lifestyle. December 1994 found Jim posing as a tourist in the lobby of Le Méridien Hotel in New Delhi. He carried a shopping bag and wore his Rolex on his right wrist. When Sergei Polyakov approached and ran his half of their recognition dialogue, Jim quietly handed over the bag. That evening, a car picked him up and took him to a commercial office where Polyakov and his colleagues waited. The shopping bag contained career trainee dossiers that Jim had printed himself. The real names, backgrounds, and future assignments of America's next generation of spies. In return, Polyakov gave him a brown paper package containing $50,000 in cash. Over the next several days, Polyakov and his team coached Jim on how to defeat the polygraph tests that every CIA officer faced periodically. They taught him breathing techniques and mental exercises to mask deception without using drugs. He was also to buy a specific laptop, a Toshiba satellite running Windows 3.1, so he could download files to diskettes and encrypt them, minimizing his chances of being caught with physical documents. Jim Nicholson must have felt that he had arrived. He was living out his spy fantasy and being paid more money than he had ever seen. But it wasn't all plain sailing. By 1995, the post-Ames reforms were starting to bite. The intelligence community had implemented new security measures, more frequent polygraph tests, and closer financial monitoring. For Jim Nicholson, this created a problem. In October and December of 1995, Nicholson underwent a series of periodic polygraph examinations, which, despite his training from the SVR, he managed to fail. The tests indicated deception in response to two key questions. Are you hiding involvement with a foreign intelligence service? And, have you had unauthorized contact with a foreign intelligence service? The CIA examiner noted that Nicholson appeared to be using classic countermeasures, such as taking deep breaths during control questions, in a clumsy attempt to manipulate the results. In the pre-Ames era, a failed polygraph might have been dismissed or explained away, but at that point in time, any hint of deception from a senior intelligence officer gave cause to trigger an investigation by the FBI Counterintelligence Squad in Washington. The FBI already suspected that there was another senior mole within CIA ranks. Some months prior, in 1994, the CIA had received a tip-off from one of its Russian sources that there was an agency man selling secrets to the SVR. While the source didn't know a name, he said the mole had worked in Asia, had spent time in the Middle East, and spoke a foreign language. It was the failed polygraph test that allowed the CIA to start joining the dots, and they then had the impetus to investigate Nicholson. An analysis of Jim Nicholson's financial records revealed a pattern of large, unexplained cash deposits that coincided with his personal foreign travel. This included a deposit of $61,000 into a Swiss bank account. The combination of deception on security questions and the sudden unexplained wealth was the classic signature of a mole. In response, a joint FBI-CIA task force was formed, representing an unprecedented level of cooperation between the two agencies that had been mandated by the US president after the Ames case. Surveillance warrants were granted, and the hunters were now hunting. What followed was a masterclass in counterintelligence investigation. Jim had planned a trip to Singapore in April of 1996. His official reason for going, which he had to report, was for a vacation and personal business. This triggered intense debate within the newly integrated FBI-CIA counterintelligence apparatus. Both agencies knew that Singapore was a hub for SVR operations, and if Jim was a Russian spy, he would likely make contact there. Rich Smiley, the CIA's station chief in Singapore and a former colleague of Jim's from Manila, recommended involving Singapore's Internal Security Department, arguing that American agents standing on every street corner would stand out too conspicuously. It was decided that the trip would be allowed to happen, and Singaporean intelligence officers followed Jim from the moment he arrived. He immediately took a surveillance detection route, known also as dry cleaning, that confirmed investigators' worst suspicions about his intentions. They watched him enter a car with Russian diplomatic plates and drive straight to the Russian embassy at 51 Nassim Road. Smiley received an urgent call from his ISD contact. Nicholson is with the Russians as we speak. The news electrified the FBI-CIA command post back at Langley. Their prime suspect had just confirmed his guilt by walking into the Russian embassy. Jim Nicholson emerged carrying a plastic bag, which was later determined to be filled with $50,000 in cash. When Smiley met Jim for lunch later that day, Jim gave him a laughing Buddha statuette that Smiley later suspected was a regift from his Russian handler. Upon his return to the United States, the investigation ramped up further. Nicholson was prevented from taking an overseas station chief job to keep him within the US. It was instead arranged for Nicholson to be moved to a new supervisory role at CIA headquarters as a branch chief within the Counterterrorism Center. Embedded with him was a veteran CIA case officer, John Maguire, who was to serve as his deputy. Maguire's true mission was to get close to Nicholson, to befriend him, and gather the final evidence needed for an arrest. A pinhole camera was surreptitiously installed in the ceiling of his office at CIA headquarters in Langley. His mail was intercepted and a court-authorized search of his notebook computer was done. Investigators were also able to recover deleted files containing classified information on Russia, Chechnya, and the Ames debriefing. Maguire's desk was positioned to observe Jim's every movement, with a secure green phone line connecting him directly to FBI agents stationed in an adjacent building. Whenever Jim left his desk, Maguire immediately alerted the surveillance team. Nicholson, displaying a fatal arrogance, trusted his new deputy a little too much. He became relaxed and sloppy in his tradecraft. On one occasion, on the 9th of October 1996, he took Maguire to a post office, where his peculiar interest in very specific commemorative postage stamps immediately signaled to the experienced Maguire that Nicholson was preparing a clandestine mailing. Later that day, Nicholson was observed dropping a parcel into a mailbox at the local post office. Most damning of all, Jim Nicholson was soon caught on the hidden camera in his office photographing classified documents. While Maguire conducted surveillance inside Langley, FBI agents prepared for more intrusive operations. They purchased an identical model of Jim's minivan to practice dismantling it, searching for hidden compartments where he might store classified materials or espionage equipment. In August of 1996, and while Jim was on official CIA business in Beirut, FBI agents conducted a covert search of his minivan in the Langley parking lot. They found his Toshiba laptop and created a mirror image of its hard drive, copying every file and deleted fragments that Jim thought he had erased for good. The laptop's contents confirmed what investigators already knew. They found a letter of instruction from Jim's Russian handler and evidence that he had copied thousands of classified files to the computer before deleting them from program directories. The deleted but recovered fragments revealed devastating intelligence losses, details about Russian recruitment attempts against CIA officers, summaries of Aldrich Ames's debriefings, and reports on Russian military operations in Chechnya. A 3.5-inch floppy disk contained even more sensitive information, details about access agents, that is, private citizens giving intelligence, summaries of CIA reports on the Russian economy and banking system, information on high-frequency radar technology, and submarine weapons systems designs. Most devastating of all were the names, biographies, and assignments of hundreds of career trainees, many of whom Jim had personally trained at the farm. These officers were supposed to be America's secret weapons in the ongoing intelligence war. Instead, their identities were now in Russian hands before they even began their careers. By October of 1996, the FBI had moved to the final phase of their investigation. They purchased the house next door to Jim's townhouse in Burke, Virginia, and installed undercover agents to conduct round-the-clock surveillance. Through the thin walls, they heard mysterious tapping noises coming from Jim's bedroom late at night. A covert sneak-and-peek entry revealed the source of the tapping: Jim's Toshiba laptop and a document scanner. He was photographing and scanning classified documents in his bedroom, creating digital copies for transmission to his Russian handlers. After a 22-month investigation, the task force had gathered all the evidence they needed. It was time to move in. On the 16th of November 1996, Harold James Nicholson drove to Dulles International Airport, preparing to board a flight to Switzerland for another meeting with his SVR handlers. This brings us back to where we started. As he walked across the tarmac, he was surrounded by FBI agents and was arrested. In his camera bag, he was carrying rolls of undeveloped film containing photographs of classified U.S. defense information. Meanwhile, the FBI descended on Nicholson's home, tearing it apart in search of further evidence. All the while, 2 of his children in their early teens watched on in disbelief. Jim Nicholson was charged in the Eastern District of Virginia with conspiracy to commit espionage. The charge carried a maximum penalty of life imprisonment without parole, and prosecutors noted that under certain statutory conditions, the death penalty was a possibility, although unlikely to be on the cards. The evidence against him, detailed in the criminal complaint and supporting affidavits, was overwhelming. It included a pattern of unexplained income totaling over $120,000, the discovery of classified documents on his person and computer that were unrelated to his duties, mail intercepted by the FBI, and the video surveillance of him photographing secret files in his CIA office. Faced with this mountain of evidence, Nicholson did what most rational people would do: he cut a deal. In March 1997, he accepted a plea bargain, pleading guilty to a single count of conspiracy to commit espionage. A central condition of the plea agreement was that Nicholson would cooperate fully with investigators and participate in extensive damage assessment debriefings. The government needed to know exactly what he had compromised. The picture that emerged from Nicholson's debriefings was devastating. The most severe damage was to the CIA's human capital. Several officers working under the deepest cover had to be withdrawn from their missions, their lives put at risk and their careers irrevocably altered. His betrayal of the trainees from the farm, his very own students, compromised an entire cohort of future spies whose careers were over before they began. Nicholson's treachery forced the CIA to assume a worst-case scenario. The agency had no choice but to cancel planned intelligence operations and reassign officers from important missions. The full impact of this loss, the critical intelligence that was never collected, and the policy decisions made without it, was deemed incalculable. On the 3rd of June 1997, Jim Nicholson stood before a federal judge for sentencing. He offered a halting, tearful apology, claiming his motivation was a misguided desire to provide for his 3 children and atone for his failures as a husband and father. The judge sentenced him to 23 years and 7 months in federal prison. Nicholson was incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon. This prison was chosen to allow him to maintain contact with his children and elderly parents. This act of mercy would prove to be a critical mistake. Once behind bars, the worldly wise and charismatic prisoner became a respected figure among his inmates. He led Mormon worship services and served as a mentor to young prisoners. But once again, Jim Nicholson was playing a double game. From his cell at FCI Sheridan, he began plotting to re-establish contact with his Russian handlers. His motivations were twofold. He felt he was owed a pension for the secrets he had already sold, and he believed he still possessed valuable, time-sensitive information that he could monetize before it became stale. His first attempts around the year 2000 were crude. He tried to convince fellow inmates to have their visiting family members mail letters for him to the Russian government. Word of these attempts trickled back through the prison system all the way to the FBI, but nothing was done immediately in the absence of any hard evidence. When Nicholson realized that his plans to re-establish comms with the Russians had not worked, he came up with something that hit a little closer to home. By 2006, Nicholson had turned his focus to his youngest son, Nathan. At the time, Nathan was a 22-year-old student at Lane Community College, still grappling with the fallout from his father's conviction. Nathan had always idolized his father, viewing him as a hero and long holding on to the belief that he had been wrongly convicted. He had even attempted to follow in his father's footsteps by joining the army and training as a paratrooper, only to have his military ambitions cut short by a parachuting injury in 2004. After an honorable discharge, Nathan worked at a local Pizza Hut in Oregon. He cherished the Saturday prison visits with his father, using them to quiz him about his army and CIA exploits, and dreaming of following in his dad's footsteps. In Nathan, Jim Nicholson saw the perfect asset, someone who loved him unconditionally, who believed in his innocence, and who would likely do anything to gain his father's approval. Jim Nicholson, a trained CIA case officer with decades of experience in spotting and exploiting vulnerabilities, recognized his son's unwavering loyalty and desperate need for paternal approval. He systematically groomed Nathan, using his professional skills to manipulate his own child into becoming a spy. Jim used religious language to frame their mission, suggesting that God had a different plan for Nathan, and that faith would lead him to missions far greater than those undertaken by men and their militaries. Nicholson framed the conspiracy as an exciting, heroic, and clandestine mission that would allow Nathan to finally make his father proud. It didn't take long for Nathan to warm up to the idea. Father and son developed a system for passing messages during the prison visits using napkins. Jim would write messages and smuggle them out by pretending to blow his nose or hiding them under his shoe arch. Nathan improved the system by suggesting that they use a shared Yahoo email account's draft folder as a modern dead drop. Messages would never actually be sent from one computer to another, they just logged into the same account and checked the drafts folder, thus avoiding any traceable email traffic. Under his father's tutelage, Nathan became an enthusiastic, if naive, agent. The father-son spy plot was activated in October of 2006. On his father's instructions, Nathan traveled to San Francisco where he, bold as brass, knocked on the door of the Russian embassy. His offer to sell secrets was treated with even more skepticism than had his father's offer before him. Eventually, however, the SVR took Nathan up on the offer. The Russians weren't interested in their former spy's plan to spring him from jail using a helicopter, but what they were interested in was the secrets still stored in Jim Nicholson's head. Just like that, a 22-year-old college student became an international spy courier. Over the next 2 years, he undertook a series of international trips to meet with Russian agents in locations that included San Francisco, Mexico City, Lima in Peru, and Cyprus. In total, he collected over $47,000 in cash on his father's behalf, which he then dispersed to family members as directed by Jim. But what information exactly was he giving them? The Russians wanted to know the details of how Jim's original espionage was discovered, who had interrogated him after his arrest, and the specifics of his CIA assignments and transfers leading up to his capture. This was counterintelligence gold, understanding exactly how their previous operation had been compromised and how American intelligence had reacted. While Nathan was conducting espionage across 3 continents, American counterintelligence was slowly awakening to the renewed threat posed by Jim Nicholson. The breakthrough came in late 2007 when CIA analysts detected peculiarities in Jim's phone calls and correspondence with Nathan. They seemed to speak a lot about money and countries with a strong Russian diplomatic presence. How odd. Investigators at the Portland FBI office began monitoring Nicholson's communications more closely and, critically, placed his son Nathan under surveillance. They bugged Nathan's car, tapped his phone lines, and monitored his emails. The FBI slowly pieced together the international plot being orchestrated from a prison cell in Oregon. In 2007, Nathan made a trip to Lima in Peru to sell more intelligence for his father. While they missed his departure from the US, upon return, the FBI made sure that Nathan was diverted through customs, where his blue pocket notebook was taken and secretly photographed. The little blue book proved pivotal, detailing his meetings with Russian operatives along with addresses, code names, recognition signals, and questions he intended to relay to his father. The FBI chose not to act just then, wanting to catch Nathan in the act of committing espionage. Investigators surveilled Nathan for the next 12 months. Finally, in December 2008, Nathan jetted off to Cyprus. He was closely surveilled and, crucially, was videoed outside of a TGI Fridays, receiving cash from a Russian intelligence officer. In December 2008, Nathan Nicholson was arrested at his apartment soon after his return to the US. An initial search of his home revealed $9,500 in cash that had been stashed in his nightstand. After the arrest and confronted with the evidence and the stark reality of his own crimes and his father's manipulation, Nathan chose to cooperate fully with the US government. His decision proved instrumental in building the new case against his father. As part of a plea agreement, Nathan detailed the entire 2-year conspiracy, explaining how his father had groomed him, passed instructions, and directed the meetings and money laundering. In January of 2009, both father and son were indicted. Instead of espionage, they were charged with conspiracy to act as an agent of a foreign government and conspiracy to commit international money laundering. While father and son faced the same charges, the legal outcomes for the two men were very different. Nathan was seen by prosecutors and the court as a victim of his father's corrupt scheme. The government's sentencing memorandum explicitly noted that Harold Nicholson, a trained CIA officer, had used his skills to groom and manipulate his own son. Jim Nicholson, the government argued, had turned his son into an unwitting dupe, in a scheme that put the young man at serious legal and physical risk. In January 2011, at age 60, Jim Nicholson was sentenced to an additional 8 years in federal prison. Nathan received a sentence of probation with no jail time, instead being ordered to perform community service. The Nicholson affair became a case study in the vulnerabilities still plaguing American intelligence. Even at a time of heightened security when the agency was still reeling from the Aldrich AIM scandal, Nicholson was able to access and photograph classified documents using CIA equipment in a CIA facility even while under some degree of suspicion. Perhaps more importantly, the second conspiracy revealed an entirely new category of threat. Never before had a convicted spy successfully orchestrated a new espionage operation from behind bars. The case forced the Bureau of Prisons and the FBI to reconsider how they monitored and restricted the communications of imprisoned intelligence operatives. The CIA, in turn, implemented more rigorous financial monitoring of its employees, increased the frequency of polygraph examinations, and enhanced physical security measures at its facilities. The installation of surveillance cameras in offices containing classified materials became standard practice, partly as a direct result of lessons learned from the Nicholson investigation. The identities of CIA officers that Nicholson compromised in the 1990s affected American intelligence operations for years afterward. The training materials and methods Nicholson revealed from the farm forced the CIA to modify its training programs and develop new techniques for preparing case officers. When Harold James Nicholson made that first contact with Russian intelligence in 1994, he probably thought he was making a simple transaction. Secrets for money. He had bills to pay, an expensive divorce to fund, and a lifestyle to maintain. It seemed like an easy way to solve his financial problems. Jim Nicholson received just less than $200,000 from the Russians over a decade of spying. In exchange, Nicholson gave up his career, his reputation, his freedom, his family, and his legacy, all the while putting many lives at risk. Jim Nicholson was released from federal prison on the 24th of November 2023 after serving more than 27 years of his combined sentences. His son Nathan has tried to build a new life, free from his father's influence and manipulation. It is unknown whether Jim Nicholson has reconnected with his family, including estranged ex-wife Laurie and his children. His relationship with his son Nathan appears to have been permanently severed.